Now, we are 5 episodes into the season, and you're smart enough to know what I'm going to say next. Today, like every day, The Haunted Screen is brought to you by Fujifilm. And you also know my feelings about Fujifilm cameras. I use them, and I like them. So I live in Brooklyn, and my neighborhood, it's super photogenic. I've fallen off in recent months, due in no small part to the time that I've poured into this podcast, but I am a pretty avid street photographer. So how about this? Take out your phone, open up Instagram, and find me at Travis_American. Those pictures you see there, they're not bad, right? I mean, I'm no Diane Arbus or Bill Cunningham, but thanks in large measure to my Fujifilm gear, I can say with some confidence that at least I don't suck at this. And it is quite frankly hard to suck with these cameras. They are excellent, and they are really easy to use. So if so inclined, I suggest you give them a look. Okay, on with the show. So it's been a couple weeks since we checked in with Weimar Cinema's ultimate power couple, the director Fritz Lang and his wife, the writer Thea von Harbou. Last we heard, they'd just come off the big, beautiful boondoggle that was 1927's Metropolis. Today we're able to recognize that film as one of the defining works of early sci-fi, but at its release, it was hated by both critics and audiences, and it nearly bankrupted UFA, the biggest studio in Europe. For some filmmakers, this could have inspired a crisis of confidence. It could have served as an impetus to take some time to clear their heads, maybe through a summer yachting around the Adriatic, or even a stint at rehab. But that's not Fritz Lang, or for that matter, Thea von Harbou. By this point in their careers, they weren't especially susceptible to having their faith in themselves shaken. And for good reason. As I said, their work on Metropolis would eventually be vindicated, and they were standing on the verge of creating a couple more classics, one of which would ultimately be their finest collaboration. The sun, as they say, was still shining on their careers. But other skies were darkening. In their personal lives, new tensions and new lovers threatened to crack the relationship that had become core to their identities, as artists and as people. Then, of course, as Germany shifted from the 1920s to the 1930s, it was inching toward one of the darkest periods that history has ever seen. When the Nazis seized power in 1933, everybody in the country was faced with stark choices, both in terms of morality and simple self-preservation. Even Lang, who claimed to have spent the Weimar era sleepwalking through history, he would be shaken awake. Fritz and Thea would make decisions that would come to define them and shape their legacies. What would they decide? I'm Travis Mushet, and this is The Haunted Screen.
Right in the middle of that future is this toxic power couple named you and me. And does it all end in tragedy and tears and a murder mystery? Yes, of course it does. But I don't care. I just got one question, Sophie. Are you ready for the ride of your fucking life?
In the Germany of 1927, the specter of fascism didn't yet loom particularly large. In the following year's parliamentary elections, the Nazi Party would get just over 2.5% of the national vote. And Lang and von Harbou, they had pressing career matters to attend to. The producer Erich Palmer, whose support had made the couple's stardom possible, he had been chased out of Berlin as the fall guy for UFA's financial ruin, which was partially attributable to the commercial failure of Metropolis. Palmer set up shop in Hollywood, first at Paramount, then at MGM, and a lot of the top German film talent followed him. Directors like E.A. DuPont and Paul Linney, and actors like Emil Jannings and Conrad Veidt, whose performance as Cesare in The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari helped to establish the credibility of both Palmer and of German film more broadly. Many in Berlin expected that Lang would head west too, or at least defect from UFA to one of its competitor studios in Germany. Lang was still licking his wounds from the Metropolis debacle, and still furious that UFA had chopped up his movie to the point of incoherence for the re-releases. And his top priority at this moment was independence. So he scrounged up a couple of investors and founded his own studio, Fritz Lang Film GmbH. A GmbH being the German equivalent to an American LLC. UFA would still handle the marketing and distribution for the new company's films, but Lang-von Harbou would have the freedom to work under their own umbrella. It was here, at a studio with Lang's name on the door, that the director and the screenwriter would make their last two silent films, an action thriller called Spies, released in 1928, and 1929 sci-fi adventure Woman in the Moon. Neither of these ranks among the couple's best remembered or best loved movies, and while they fared better commercially than Metropolis had, neither one was a bona fide blockbuster. The films both showed that classic Langian technical brilliance, but in the service of weak stories. At the debut of Spies, attendees were given beautifully bound editions of von Harbou's novelization of the film. The critic Siegfried Krakauer saw these books as a metaphor for the film itself. Quote, virtuosity alienated from content, posed as art. Lang-von Harbou's problems, they weren't limited to their creative projects. The leading lady in both Spies and Woman in the Moon was a young Austrian stage actress named Gerda Maurus. Lang had met her during a trip to Vienna in 1924, and, based on what you already know about him, it probably won't shock you to know that he wasn't only, or even primarily after her talent. Even in the brain-meltingly attractive world of the entertainment industry, Maurus's contemporaries saw her beauty as warranting special note. One journalist wrote that she had an indescribably beautiful face. She had very high cheekbones, eyes set wide apart. This gave her face something foreign, something strange, something tremendously riveting and exciting. Lang must have agreed. His attraction to her returned as soon as Maurus arrived on the set of Spies near the end of 1927. Not that this crush meant that he would go easy on her. This is still the guy who literally set Bridget Helm on fire for the climax of Metropolis. During the filming of Spies, Maurus was struck with appendicitis and needed her appendix removed. Even now, in 2022, with almost a century of developments in medical science, doctors recommend not returning to work for up to a month after an appendectomy. Lang almost immediately forced his star to run, strain, and sweat. And, in a replay of his antics during the production of Dr. Mabuse the Gambler, he also insisted that he himself shoot out a window located just behind Maurus's head. The actress was terrified, which was part of the point, to get her real terror on screen. And Lang demanded like 20 takes of the scene, trying all kinds of weapons to get the perfect bullet hole. A pistol, a slingshot, even a shotgun. Still, Maurus was as attracted to the brilliant, if deranged, older director as he was to her, and a familiar pattern emerged. You might remember from 2 episodes ago when we talked about how Lang refused to do his first wife, Lisa Rosenthal, the dignity of keeping his affair with von Harbou discreet. Instead, he forced her to go out to eat with him and his mistress, and even rented von Harbou an apartment in the same building where he and Rosenthal lived. All of that recurs here, with really shocking specificity. He'd take Maurus out to Berlin's fanciest restaurants, and sometimes he brought von Harbou along to sit across from the woman that Lang seemed to be positioning as her replacement. And he even brought back the old stash the girlfriend in the same building as your wife trick, renting Maurus a flat just down the hall. Lang got what he wanted, a wife and collaborator at home, and a gorgeous and glamorous paramour just steps away from his front door. But of course, it was less optimal for the women involved. Von Harbou had to endure the humiliation of Lang's very public affair, the same situation that had led to Rosenthal's suicide or murder, depending on what you believe. And Maurus was ensnared in a violent relationship with one of the most powerful men in European film. Multiple people close to the pair attested to the fact that Lang was known to get physical with Maurus. He would reportedly beat her to the point that she struggled to walk. The dynamics of abusive relationships are notoriously complicated and difficult for outsiders to figure out, so her friends' attempts to intervene failed. When one asked why she tolerated the violence, she simply said, if she didn't mind, no one else should either. And when Maurus came up during Lang's 1974 interview with William Friedkin, almost a half-century after their time together, it was only in the context of Lang claiming credit for her success.
An actress, Gerda Maurus, which I created as a star, and so on and so on.
So by the time the 1920s became the 1930s, Lang and von Harbou's marriage, it wasn't a happy one, it wasn't a warm one, but it was still a productive one, even if their roles were becoming more separate and less synergistic. With Woman in the Moon, they broke with their convention of sharing the screenwriting credit, attributing the script to von Harbou alone. And while nowadays you usually see them both credited for the screenplay of their next film, M, initially it went only to von Harbou. She seems to be the one who deserved it. Even after M was enshrined as a masterpiece, and von Harbou was too dead to stake her own claim, Lang eschewed his habit of taking credit for other people's work, saying in a 1954 interview that he took no credit for the screenplay, and that, quote, "the script credit went to my wife." For the time being, at least, their creative partnership allowed the Lang-von Harbou marriage to hang on by a thread, and German democracy was in a similarly perilous position, due in no small part to events unfolding across the Atlantic.
Sure, business is punk, and Wall Street is sunk. We're all of us broke, and ready to broke. We've nothing.
In October of 1929, the New York Stock Exchange crashed like it has never crashed before or since, losing nearly a quarter of its value in the space of 2 days. Things would only get worse over the next few years. When the market hit its bottom in July 1932, it was roughly 90% below where it was before the crash 3 years earlier. 90%. If you, like me, were educated in the United States, you likely got a very America-centric view of the Depression. You know, like,
the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
the New Deal and the Dust Bowl and unshaven men selling apples in the streets of Manhattan. But of course, after a century plus of industrial capitalism, economic catastrophe no longer recognized national borders.
But practically overnight, an economic blizzard swept the world. In Japan, France, Britain, always the unemployed, the soup kitchens, the grinding poverty, and the despair.
The devastation reverberated through much of the world, especially in Germany. To navigate the turmoil of hyperinflation in the early 1920s and the reparation payments that were hoisted on them with the Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I, Germany had become reliant on American loans. When the bottom fell out of the market, those American lenders didn't just stop lending. They called in payment on loans that were still outstanding. Then, in 1930, the United States imposed the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, which increased taxes levied on more than 20,000 imported products to protect American companies from foreign competition. Suddenly, the country that had been the biggest market for German industrial goods wasn't buying nearly as many of them. The German economy contracted, unemployment skyrocketed, and people got scared. As is often the case, the scared people sought out demagogues who at least offered them someone to blame. Hitler and the Nazis were waiting with open arms. In the September 1930 federal elections, the party got more than 7 times the vote share from just 2 years earlier, receiving over 18% of the ballots and jumping from 12 seats in the Reichstag to 107. The Nazis were now the second largest party in Germany, just 36 seats behind the center-left Social Democratic Party, the SPD. In any case, the leadership of the Reichstag was proving incapable of rising to the moment. Its governing coalition had collapsed in March of 1930, and after the September elections, there was no hope of forming a majority, not with the success of the Nazis and of the Communists, who had themselves gained 23 seats to bring their total up to 77. For the SPD, sharing power with the former was, of course, out of the question, and the latter famously rejected the Social Democrats as social fascists and believed that a rising Nazi party would provoke a backlash that would set the stage for communist revolution. As the KPD slogan put it, "Nach Hitler kommen wir." After Hitler, us. Without a majority, Chancellor Heinrich Brüning, himself a centrist appointed by President Paul von Hindenburg, he could only govern through emergency decrees rather than the normal parliamentary process. Democracy, then, was already weakening in Germany, and the measures that Brünig was able to impose on the country, they were not good ones. When an economy is flailing the way that Germany's was in 1930, one of the surest ways to juice it is for the government to ramp up spending, hence FDR and the New Deal. Brünig, though, was terrified that that kind of spending would send the economy spiraling into another round of inflation and that any deficits would cripple the government. So, out of fear of problems that might happen, he took steps that worsened problems that were happening. He raised taxes and slashed government spending, leaving people with less money to buy things, and state-subsidized industries with less money to hire workers. More Germans lost their jobs, and as they watched their democratically elected government only deepen their suffering, more people became open to anti-democratic solutions. Gridlock has a way of opening the door for authoritarianism. Given current events here in the United States, it hits a little close to home.
I didn't do it, I tell you, and I'm glad I didn't do it. And if I had it all to do over again, I wouldn't do it all over again.
Mais qu'est-ce que c'est ça?
You had to walk in just when I was going good. In a minute, I might have been another Peter Lorre.
The darkness of the moment was getting to people. In film, in literature, and in the press, the popular taste shifted toward the grisly. Weimar Germany, especially late Weimar Germany, it was a culture fascinated with true crime. I guess we can add that to the eerily tall pile of things that the contemporary United States shares with the Weimar era. But then, as now, the public couldn't get enough of serial killers. After all the country had been through since the Great War, these murderers who killed for pleasure or out of compulsion, they seemed to be a fitting symbol for a society in decay. The most famous of these was Peter Kürten, the so-called vampire of Dusseldorf. Kürten murdered at least 9 women and girls and attempted to kill at least 31 more. And those killings were vicious. There was rape, there was torture, and, as his nickname suggests, there was blood drinking. Though von Harbou had completed the screenplay for the film that would become M before Kürten's arrest in May 1930, the press coverage of these as yet unsolved killings had captivated her. But it wasn't so much the lurid, gory details that interested von Harbou as the fact of the coverage itself, the way that a single psychopath could send a whole community into hysteria. As she began crafting her own serial killer screenplay, she and Lang began looking into other Weimar murderers. Of particular interest were sadists who took steps to implicate their neighbors in their crimes, often by tricking them into acts of cannibalism. Especially during the trying times immediately after the war, and during the hyperinflation, a lot of people were desperate for sustenance. Meat particularly was in short supply, and a few killers found sick ways to take advantage of their community's hunger. There was Karl Grossmann, who killed prostitutes and possibly fed their remains to visitors to his hot dog stand. There's Karl Danke, who also sold human meat to unsuspecting customers, not to mention that he tanned the skin of his victims to make belts and used their hair as shoelaces. And there was Fritz Haarmann, who sexually abused and mutilated at least 24 boys and young men before allegedly selling their remains in the black market as ground pork. Haarmann had a specific look to him. A professor of psychology at the time described him like this. Of average height, broad and well built, he had a coarse, rough, shiny full moon face. The physiognomy was noticeably tight, trapped in the grip of the self, but at the same time, he appeared to be unbelievably talkative, wanting sympathy, and hyperactive. His voice mushy, smarmy, and close to a treble was like the querulous voice of an old woman. His whole disposition was androgynous, not masculine or feminine, and not childlike, but a combination of all three. As the film scholar Anton Kayes points out in his BFI Films Classics installment on M, this is also a strikingly accurate description of Peter Lorre, whose astonishing performance as the child murderer Hans Beckert instantly made him into a film legend with his first major movie role. If you're a fan of Golden Age Hollywood productions, you likely already know who Laurie is.
But when you first came to Casablanca, I thought...
You thought what?
What right do I have to think?
But even if that doesn't ring a bell, you probably saw him, or versions of him at least, before you hit your 6th birthday. You see, his disconcertingly sinister look, his distinctively pliable face, his voice and accent, his whole deal, it lent itself incredibly well to animation, and animators have taken every opportunity to reference him, even as those references fly over the heads of their young audience. A mad scientist based on the actor appears in 2 Looney Tunes shorts.
I need that wishbone very badly.
My wishbone? Why, that little monster.
The voice of Mr. Big, a villain from Rocky and Bullwinkle, is basically the actor Bill Scott doing his best Peter Lorre impression.
That's Mr. Big? Why don't you pick on somebody your own size? He is the littlest thing I ever did see.
Characters based on him have appeared on Scooby-Doo,
Nice donkey.
and the Flintstones,
Thank you, Mr. Flintstein.
It's Flintstone.
and more recently on The Simpsons,
Do we even exist? Who knows?
Hey, let me off this thing.
and Tiny Toon Adventures.
It makes me want to do terrible, horrible things to him.
Laurie was even the inspiration for both Ren from Ren and Stimpy,
You stupid idiot.
and the mascot for Boo Berry cereal.
Part of this complete breakfast.
Check out the show notes for a few examples of cartoon Peter Lorre. But in 1930, that level of ubiquity was way off in the future. Not to say that Laurie hadn't made a name for himself. At 26, he was one of the most promising stars on the Berlin stage, and a favorite of Bertolt Brecht, the profoundly influential Marxist playwright who we discussed last week in the context of his collaboration with G.W. Pabst on the Threepenny Opera. Laurie, though, is a genuine rags-to-riches story. He was born Laszlo Lowenstein in 1904 to a Hungarian Jewish family in a small town in the Carpathian Mountains. Little Laszlo's mother died when he was just 4 years old, and his relationships with his father and stepmother were strained. When the Second Balkan War broke out in 1913, the family moved to Vienna, which proved to be a much better fit for this odd little prodigy with a taste for the arts. After stints as a bank clerk and a literal clown, he started getting theater roles, first in Vienna, then Breslau and Zurich, and finally Berlin, where his career got turbocharged. It was there that Laurie landed a role in Marie-Louise Fleischer's Pioneers in Ingolstadt, a play that lampooned the sexism and narrow-mindedness of Bavarian small-town life. His performance as Fabian, a tender young man who goes through the motions of misogyny to fit in with his peers, it impressed both Brecht, who was at the time Fleischer's lover and the co-director of the play, and Lang, who was enthralled by his performance and decided that this was the man that he wanted to star in his first film to use synchronized sound. See, Lang-von Harbou had a fraught relationship with the sound revolution in cinema. Warner Brothers released the first sound feature, The Jazz Singer, in 1927, and almost instantly, silent film fell out of fashion. The couple, however, they weren't sold on this new technology. Lang even published an essay in defense of the silent film, but it wasn't enough to turn back the tide of history. By the time Woman in the Moon came out in late 1929, it already looked hopelessly out of date. So much so that at the last minute, Ufa tried to convince Lang to insert sound effects into the film after the fact.
And I said, no, I will not do it. Because in my opinion, if you show a silent film and then comes sound and then is silent again, you kill the rhythm of the film.
This disagreement was actually the cause of Ufa's final break with Lang. The studio heads lost their patience with him and chose not to renew his contract. And without Ufa handling distribution and marketing, Fritz Lang Film GmbH was effectively dead. But as difficult as he could be to work with and work for, Lang was still arguably the preeminent director of his generation. He was not going to stay a free agent for long. Seymour Niebenzahl, the American-born son of an Austrian film distributor, won Lang-von Harbou over to Nero Film, the studio his father had founded and that he himself managed. Nero Film was still a fledgling operation, just 4 years old, and Niebenzahl himself was only around 30. But this would be the studio and the producer to escort Weimar Cinema's power couple into the sound era. When you watch M, you can sense Lang-von Harbou's reluctance to fully embrace audio. It's a quiet movie that's relatively light on dialogue, so much so that it's been called a silent film with sound. But the sound it does use is put in the service of a captivating story. Dark, but captivating. We're in Berlin, 1930, and as a little girl named Elsie walks home from school, she's approached by a man, seen only in shadow, but made audible by his habit of whistling a riff from Grieg's score for Peer Gynt. The crime itself also remains off-screen, but we see Elsie's ball roll away and her balloon float into the telephone lines. It turns out that the city has been experiencing a rash of child murders, and its citizens are in a panic. Predictably, the press stokes the flames of fear while the police scramble to find the killer. Their zealousness puts local criminal elements under a new scrutiny, so the bosses of the underworld unite to catch the murderer themselves, using the city's beggars as their eyes and ears. One such beggar, a blind man, recognizes the killer by his telltale whistling and alerts a Confederate who uses chalk to write the letter M on his own hand. M for murderer, and he pretends to stumble into the guilty party, rubbing the letter onto his coat. A child, poised to be the next victim, points out the mark to the killer, who realizes that he's in trouble and sprints into an office building. Meanwhile, the police discover the murderer's identity. He's a former mental patient named Hans Beckert. The cops narrowly miss catching the mobsters who are abducting Beckert from the building where he's hiding, but the thugs manage to drag him off to an abandoned distillery where they put him on trial before a jury that consists of Berlin's entire criminal underworld. In one of film history's all-time classic monologues, Beckert passionately defends himself, claiming that he's powerless over his compulsion to kill. I have no control over this, he says. This evil thing inside of me, the fire, the voices, the torment. The criminals are having none of it. And just as they're about to kill Beckert, the police arrive, saving the child murderer from execution, at least for the moment. After sci-fi extravaganzas like Metropolis and Woman in the Moon, and fantastical adventures like Dr. Mabuse the Gambler, Die Nibelungen, and Spies, the realism of M feels like a departure for Lang-von Harbou. Maybe it was the influence of the Neue Sachlichkeit, or the New Objectivity, that movement towards socially engaged art that we discussed last week in relation to Pabst. But, to their credit, the husband and wife team went to great lengths to ensure the authenticity of their project. They visited police headquarters, both at Alexanderplatz in Berlin and Scotland Yard in London. They read not just the crime coverage in the popular press, but also more academic journals of criminology, like Kriminalistische Monatshefte. And they made the most of their access to the criminal underworld.
I told you that I was interested in Alexanderplatz and so, and I met a lot of criminals. And I asked them if they would like to work in a film of mine.
So Lang recruited some convicts that he met at police headquarters. And what's more, the top defense attorney for the Berlin underworld had a cameo as a gangster. And actors who weren't actual criminals took inspiration from the real thing. It was fashionable at the time for artists to gain honorary membership in Berlin's Ringvereine, its gangs. One such artist was Gustav Gründgens, who plays the film's godfather of crime. No doubt his experience with actual mobsters informed the icy haughtiness that he brought to the role. Suffice it to say that Lang-von Harbou did their homework. They always did. It was the only way that Lang could exercise his dictatorial control over every aspect of the film's production. Thea von Harbou's secretary later remembered the level of detail in the screenplay, saying, quote, "The thoroughness of Fritz Lang and his wife can hardly be described. I saw many other film manuscripts, but never one which could compare with the manuscript for M. 2 typewriter ribbons were stuck together to give us 3 colors, one black and red, and the other blue. The camera work and action were typed in black, the dialogue in blue, and the sound, where synchronized, was typed in red." The secretary doesn't even mention the notes concerning editing, lighting, and more. For these two, the screenplay wasn't a malleable, living document. It didn't leave much space at all for play or personal expression on the part of the crew and the cast. It was more like a diagram or an equation that explained exactly how the film would turn out. And Peter Lorre, he fucking hated this rigid work style, and he hated Lang even more. Lang was the same asshole on the set of M that he was on every other set. His demands for take after take would have exhausted even a well-rested actor, but Lorre was stretched thin. After M was done shooting for the day, he was still contracted to act in a play in the evening, and then rehearse a new project with Brecht on top of that. One day on M's shooting schedule had been set aside to capture reaction shots of the underworld jury at the film's climax, and since Lorre didn't need to be on camera, he asked for the day off to rest. Lang didn't just say no. He threatened Lorre with an injunction. So the actor showed up and stood around all day for no good reason. Also in the trial scene, there's a shot where Lorre is thrown down the stairs. There was no stuntman, no padding, and really no precautions taken. His fellow actors just flung him down the staircase again and again and again, somewhere around a dozen times. One of the finest actors in Germany, in the world really, he wound up so beaten and bruised that he had to beg the director to stop the abuse. Strangely, accounts suggest that Lang genuinely liked Lorre, and he was baffled as to why the actor would never work with him again. Self-awareness was not one of his strong suits. While there was some concern that the German censors would object to such a dark film, when M debuted at the Ufa Palast am Zoo Theater on May 11, 1931, it was the version that Lang intended. According to the director, the censorship officials told him and von Harbou that, quote, "This film shows everything which we are opposed to showing in a picture, but it is done with such honesty and integrity that we don't want to make one cut." To me, this sounds like some self-serving bullshit, and considering the source, I think I'm right. But regardless of what the censors said or didn't say, the film is a milestone achievement. Decades later, Fritz Lang would be interviewed by the god of the French New Wave, Jean-Luc Godard, and Godard asked him which of his films would stand the test of time.
Pour vous, à mon avis, je crois que c'est...
Lang didn't have to stop and think it over.
C'est M, oui.
M, he answered, and Godard agreed with the assessment. There is a reason for that. A lot of reasons. The craftsmanship, the writing, the film's commitment to serious moral inquiry, and, of course, Lorre's performance. And though some critics were put off by the way that the film forces the audience to empathize with a character who has done such repulsive things, its reviews were strong overall. One positive review came from an interesting source, Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi who, in under 2 years' time, would head Hitler's Ministry of Propaganda. In his journal, he gave this appraisal of the movie. "Fantastic! Against humanitarian soppiness. For the death penalty. Well made. Lang will be our director one day." For what it's worth, Lang always claimed that M was a statement against the death penalty, not for it. But there are other aspects of the film that may have appealed to Goebbels. Remember, Peter Lorre was Jewish, and in the Germany of the 1930s, Jews were often portrayed as perverted, pathetic, and dangerous, not unlike the character of Hans Beckert. And, to again cite Anton Kays, the head mobster, who looks all the world like an SS officer in his black leather trench coat, he spoke of Beckert in terms that seemed to anticipate the Holocaust. Quote, "This monster has no right to live. He must disappear. He must be exterminated without pity, without scruples." The Nazis would even go on to use excerpts from Beckert's confession speech in their most notorious propaganda film, The Eternal Jew. Right-wing audiences may have also approved of the overall depiction of Weimar society. The Berlin of the film is a place of moral rot. The government is so ineffectual that it falls to the criminals to find and dispense with the man who is preying on the city's children. If you were so inclined, you could see him as advocating a kind of fascist will to power. When the state, when democracy fails to keep order, it must be maintained by whoever is strong enough, ruthless enough to enforce it, through violence if necessary. That's a reading of the film, but I don't think it's the truest reading. Just because a film diagnoses and depicts the conditions that would make a fearful public comfortable with brutality, it doesn't mean that the film endorses that comfort. In that final speech that von Harbou wrote and that Laurie fucking knocked out of the park, there's too much humanity there, too much of a willingness to put us in the shoes of an outsider, arguably a monster, and to ask ourselves if killing such a disturbed soul is ethical. It's a nuanced film, a thoughtful film, and fascism is neither of those things. I just can't see M as a manifestation of Nazi morality. Now, there's one detail about Beckert that was ultimately cut from the film, but I think it may tell us something about Lang. In a journal entry from 1930, Lang wrote down an idea: war scene as an excuse for the child murderer before the underworld court. As we've touched on again and again this season, a generation of Germans was devastated by World War I. Many were killed, many more were maimed, and virtually everyone was traumatized. Of course, I can't speak to what it must have been like to spend years in the trenches, surrounded by mechanized death, day after day. But it doesn't seem like the kind of thing that you get over. And, as Sigmund Freud was starting to explore back in Lang's era, violence begets violence. The 9 decades of psychological research since M's release have only confirmed that soldiers don't leave their experiences on the battlefield. They bring them home, sometimes in tragic ways. By its nature, the military trains people to be violent. It celebrates individuals for their capacity to kill. The act of killing is traumatic, and PTSD breaks people. We see the consequences with disturbing regularity. An Army vet murders his wife. A Marine shoots up a bar. It's not so crazy to think that Hans Beckert brought the war home, so to speak. That the things he saw at the Somme or Passchendaele shattered him, or else gave him the opportunity to discover his taste for blood. This is all the more resonant given Lang's own history. Remember that he fought for the Austrian army during the war. He saw fighting, he saw killing, and he was by all accounts an excellent soldier. He had an aptitude for it. When his first wife, Lisa Rosenthal, when she walked in on him in flagrante with von Harbou, was that part of him triggered? Did it resurface? Was he another war vet who, in a moment of stress, put a bullet in somebody close to him? I'll be the first to admit that this is speculation, but I'm not sure that it's wild speculation. We'll probably never know if Lang murdered his wife, and if he did, we'll definitely never know what opaque psychological processes disposed him to do so. But maybe there's a reason that Fritz Lang, a man who no one would describe as empathetic, maybe there's a reason that he was able to muster empathy for a killer of the innocent, and to make a film that forces us to muster it too. To be clear, the horrors of the battlefield, unfathomable as they are, they're no excuse for killing your wife, for killing children, for killing anyone. But of course that's easy for me to say. Me, someone who's never been in so much as a fist fight. But despite my relative comfort, despite the fact that my country has never forced me to murder and then pinned a medal to my chest for doing so, I think this moral intuition is right. But even if war traumas are no excuse, maybe they're part of the explanation.
Yo, dude! Is this the line for SpongeBob's party?
Oh, yes. I brought the birthday cake.
The triumph of M, it wasn't enough to salvage the relationship between Fritz and Thea. Gerda Maurus broke off the relationship with Lang while he was working on the film, and he'd taken up with a married socialite and Marlene Dietrich lookalike with the fantastic name of Lily Latte. Given what you know about Lang and his philandering, I'd venture a guess that you're not especially surprised by this. But by 1931, 1932, there was a new wrinkle. Thea von Harbou had found a new man. Through a decade of affairs and humiliations, she had stayed faithful. Then, she met I.E. Tendolkar. Tendolkar was born in Balgundi, India in 1904. He'd studied math at the Sorbonne, but had taken a gig covering the Asia beat for the leftist newspaper Die Weltbühne. Despite being inside of 30 when he met Thea, he was already on his second wife, the German actress Eva Schöbring. It kind of seems like the guy had a thing for women in show business. The fact that von Harbou and Tendolkar were both married didn't seem to be much of an issue, nor did the 16 years she had on him. It took Lang a while to figure out what was going on. He was preoccupied with latte, and past experience had given him no indication that his long-suffering wife would be anything but faithful. That was until he walked in on Thea and I.E. in his bed, just as Lisa Rosenthal had walked in on him and Thea years earlier. Hypocrite that he was, Lang was absolutely furious with his wife, and the couple finally separated. Von Harbou, she got her own apartment, far from the city center, out by the Grunewald forest on the outskirts of Berlin. It was a long time coming. It wasn't just that they were drifting apart personally. Their, intellectual interests had been diverging for some years now. See, there's something I haven't mentioned about Thea von Harbou. By the early 1930s, she was well into her slow drift towards Nazism. Her political trajectory is a strange and contradictory one, not terribly unlike the stories you hear of people who voted for Obama in 2008, but still found themselves attacking the US Capitol in January 2021. Now, you can see seeds of her right-wing tendencies as far back as the First World War, when she wrote nationalist novels valorizing the magnificence of German culture and the German people. But nationalism was kind of the thing at that point, across Europe and across the political spectrum. Outside certain small pockets of leftists, remember Liebknecht, Luxemburg, and the Spartacists, outside of them, most people were seduced by the patriotic narratives that their governments were spinning. And in the years following the war, von Harbou was a strong proponent of legal abortion and women's rights. Remember, this was a woman who reached the pinnacle of her profession in the 1920s. For all of her traditional femininity, the knitting and the cooking and the nurturing of the actors that her husband abused, she was in a lot of ways a feminist pioneer. But as the 20s became the 30s, and the Nazis gained momentum, von Harbou, like many Germans, or at least like many white, non-Jewish straight Germans with conservative leanings, she was seduced. Maybe it's not terribly surprising. With the exception of M, the films that she and her husband made together were spectacles. And you just need to look at footage of a Nuremberg rally to know that the Nazis were gifted in that regard.
This year they say there are 800,000 pairs of boots standing heel to heel, waiting for the Führer's final speech.
Indem ich euch ihre Blicke weise ich, mein Lebenskampf ist nicht umsonst gekämpft.
I guess game recognized game. Lang, however, he didn't care much about politics. He didn't care about much outside of his films. And he and von Harbou still had one more to finish together, The Testament of Dr. Mabuse, a sequel to their 1922 picture about the titular doctor. As with the first installment, this movie combined fantasy flourishes with material ripped from the headlines of Weimar Berlin. The film's street-level violence would have been very familiar to Germans who'd grown acclimated to running battles between Nazi brown shirts and the communist Rotfront. When it came to current events, though, Fritz Lang seems to have been most interested in them on an aesthetic level, or a dramatic level. As always, he showed a little boy's enthusiasm for big explosions. When the script called for a chemical factory to blow up, Lang insisted on detonating it himself, and on putting his crew in unconscionably close proximity to the blast. The cinematographer Fritz Arno Wagner remembered how terrifying the moment was, telling an interviewer, "It was only at the instant when Lang pushed on the buttons, which was followed by an incredible explosion, sending everything 240 feet into space, that I realized the danger we were all in. I still get cold sweats when I think about it." It's no wonder that colleagues had encouraged Wagner to make up his will before working with Lang again. The Testament of Dr. Mabuse was in post-production when the world changed. After 2 elections had failed to create a governing coalition in the Reichstag, a group of businessmen and politicians wrote what came to be known as the Industriellen Eingabe, or Industrial Petition. The letter called on President Paul von Hindenburg to break the deadlock and appoint Adolf Hitler as Chancellor, which was the office that held the real executive power in the German system. The signatories insisted that Hitler would govern independent from parliamentary parties and initiate an era that would create the vital basis for a resurgence of the German economy and enrapture millions of people. One of those to sign the letter was Alfred Hugenberg, the owner of UFA. President Hindenburg caved to the pressure and made Hitler Chancellor on January 30th, 1933. Within 2 months, the Weimar Republic would be dead, and German democracy along with it. The next step toward authoritarianism came on the night of February 27th.
Here you see the Reichstag, the German House of Parliament in Berlin, which has been seriously destroyed by fire.
Though the details of the arson are still in dispute, the historical consensus is that the fire was set by a 24-year-old Dutch communist named Marinus van der Lubbe. When van der Lubbe was arrested, he claimed that he had acted alone, and he was probably being honest. Most historians believe that he was a lone wolf who hoped to rally the German working class to rise up against Hitler's new administration. But if that's the case, his plan backfired as bad as any plan has ever backfired. The Nazi propaganda machine went into overdrive, with Hitler and his team blaming the fire on a communist conspiracy. The way they framed it, the attack on the Reichstag was just the opening salvo of a communist revolt, and radical steps were necessary to preserve order. The very next day, February 28, 1933, Hitler persuaded Hindenburg to sign a document that's known to history as the Reichstag Fire Decree. According to the decree, it was now, quote, permissible to restrict the rights of personal freedom, freedom of expression, including the freedom of the press, the freedom to organize and assemble, the privacy of postal, telegraphic, and telephonic communications. Warrants for house searches, orders for confiscations, as well as restrictions on property are also permissible beyond the legal limits otherwise prescribed. The way the Nazis so quickly and so deftly turned the arson to their advantage, it made a lot of people really suspicious. And there is a subset of historians who still argue, with some evidence, that the Nazis lit the flames themselves as an excuse to smear their opponents and consolidate power. Even today, people will use Reichstag fire as a byword for false flag operations. Just look at this official statement from the Oregon Republican Party.
Quote, there is growing evidence that the violence at the Capitol was a false flag operation designed to discredit President Trump, his supporters, and all conservative Republicans. It actually compares the Capitol storming to the 1933 Reichstag fire that the Nazis used to take over Germany.
Jesus fucking Christ. In any case, Hitler wasted no time putting those new powers to use. Inside of 2 weeks, he'd used the decree to arrest somewhere around 10,000 people, 4,000 of them communists, including Ernst Thälmann, the chairman of the Communist Party of Germany. So by this point, the table was set for Hitler's dictatorship to truly begin. 3 weeks later, on March 23rd, the Nazis strong-armed the Reichstag into essentially ratifying its own obsolescence through the passage of the Enabling Act. The act allowed the Chancellor, i.e. Hitler, to issue and enforce laws without the approval of Parliament or the involvement of President Paul von Hindenburg. To make sure the bill would pass, the Nazis used the Reichstag fire decree to arrest every communist member of Parliament, and some democratic socialists for good measure. And, in case any members of Hitler's coalition got cold feet, the brown shirts were on hand to remind them that their Nazi partners were more than happy to use force should persuasion fail. By a vote of 444 to 94, the Nazi nightmare became the German reality. I assume that Thea von Harbou was thrilled by these developments, and even Lang could no longer pretend to be above politics. Like everyone else in Germany, he'd have to pick a side. Which side he'd pick, though, was very much an open question. Just 5 days after the passage of the Enabling Act, Joseph Goebbels, now the Reichsminister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, he hosted a big get-together for the key players in the country's film industry. To this point, Fritz Lang had never been an adamant Nazi, or really an adamant anything, except an adamant fan of Fritz Lang. However, he definitely had not shown himself to be particularly adverse to Nazism, even with his half-Jewish background. Multiple people remember a swastika flag flying over the Lang-von Harbou household in the early 1930s. This was almost definitely von Harbou's doing, but given what we know about Lang's desperate desire for control, it's hard to fathom that he'd allow such a bold statement of political affiliation if he found the ideology to be even a little bit noxious. And the day before Goebbels' big, swanky film soiree, an official announcement listed Lang as a, quote, zealous member of the newly established Nazi Directors Unit. Years later, Lang would give the legalistic and not exactly convincing justification that he was not in a managerial position for that or any other Nazi organization. The dinner itself would be the last time that von Harbou and Lang would ever see each other in person. She, a big fucking Nazi, was obviously in attendance. And he, a big fucking advocate for his own interests, was there too, sitting next to Joseph Goebbels. And while Patrick McGilligan, that incredible Herculean Lang biographer whose book you should absolutely read if you're into this history, while Patrick McGilligan hasn't been able to confirm this, one journalist present would later claim that Lang wore a Nazi uniform to the proceedings. Though Lang boasted to a colleague that Goebbels was a personal friend of his, that wasn't enough to get The Testament of Dr. Mabuse into German theaters. Literally the day after that industry party, the German Board of Film Censors announced that the movie had been banned. Despite his admiration for Lang's work, Goebbels was concerned that Mabuse's gang could inspire rebellion against the new fascist government. In his words, they showed that an incredibly dedicated group of people are capable of overthrowing any state with violence. While Nero Film was still able to get Testament distributed abroad, it was abundantly clear the direction that the domestic film industry was headed. The same day that the movie's ban was announced, UFA fired every Jew on its payroll. There are a couple versions of what happened next. You've got Lang's version, and then you have the truth, as best as biographers and film historians have been able to piece it together. That tendency that's come up so frequently in the 2 episodes that we've spent on him and von Harbou, that tendency to self-mythologize, to bend the truth so far that it snaps, this is its ultimate, most egregious manifestation. Only the death, possibly the murder of his first wife Lisa Rosenthal, rivals it in terms of self-serving dishonesty. But I'm going to start with the tale that Lang told, or really the tales, because his story changed from telling to telling. According to Lang, sometime in late March or early April of 1933, he was summoned to pay a visit to Goebbels' office in the Mitte neighborhood of central Berlin.
It was a tremendous big room, and the one side at least 4 or 5 big windows. Goebbels could turn on friendliness like a faucet. He came out with stretched hands, said, "Mr. Lang, I'm so very, very happy to see you here. Come sit down."
Whenever he told this story, Lang pretty much always took the opportunity to talk up Goebbels' charisma. Elsewhere, he's called him, quote, the most charming man you can imagine. And this charming man was such an admirer of Lang's films that he even apologized for banning The Testament of Dr. Mabuse. According to the propaganda minister, Fritz had another powerful fan.
The Führer has seen your films. He didn't say which one. And he has said, this is the man who will give us the National Socialistic film.
So you hear there that Lang told William Friedkin that he didn't know which of his movies Hitler had seen. But in other tellings, he gave the weird flex that the Nibelungen had brought the dictator to tears. No matter the version, the encounter always centered on a proverbial offer you can't refuse.
He said, you would naturally, under my guidance, become the leader of all the German films.
The highest echelons of Nazi leadership saw Lang as the man to take charge of the Reichsfilmkammer, a new government agency that would oversee the whole German movie-making industry. They wanted to make him, in McGilligan's words, the Nazis' Führer of film. But there was the matter of the director's ethnic heritage.
My mother was born Catholic, but her parents were Jewish. So again he turned on his charm.
Oh, get a room, Fritz.
And said, Mr. Lang, we decide who is an Aryan.
To other people, Lang said that Goebbels was super impressed with his military record from the First World War, and that it was a factor in the invitation to shed his Jewish roots. Lang wasn't ready to accept, though. As Goebbels droned on and on,
talked and talked and talked,
Fritz sat there sweating.
I was wet all over my body.
With one eye on the clock.
And the hand on the clock moved and moved and moved.
He says that he knew he couldn't turn down the job offer, and that he'd need to escape Germany that same night. With the conversation dragging on, he realized that he wasn't going to get out of there before the banks closed. But finally, the meeting wrapped up, and Lang diplomatically told Goebbels that he would think the offer over. Then he rushed home to pick up some jewelry and the cash that he had on hand.
And I had always 5 $1,000 notes.
That number fluctuates. Sometimes he said it was 3,000 marks, other times the equivalent of 2,500 US dollars. But however much money he had in his pocket, he used some of it to buy himself a train ticket.
The train to Paris goes at 8 o'clock.
Even this early in the Third Reich, this sort of international rail journey was already perilous for prospective refugees. And Lang knew that once he was on the train, he would have to hide his valuables.
And I put the jewelry with the tape behind the toilet, you know.
And his cash.
And then I went to my car to hide the 5 1,000 mark bills. I took a razor blade, made a cut in the carpet, and then came the great disappointment. The carpet was glued to the floor.
So he went to the dining car to rethink his plan. That's where he came across a complaint book, where passengers could, well, complain.
So when nobody watched me, I took this book out, put my 5 1,000 mark bills into it, put it back.
At the border with Belgium, Nazi brown shirts boarded the train to check out the passengers and make sure there was no funny business going on. But they were nothing that couldn't be handled with a little bit of play acting.
So I started to snore.
These particularly courteous Nazis couldn't bring themselves to disturb him. Now safely off of German soil, he could collect his things and disembark in Paris. And not a moment too soon. Lang says it was a matter of days before all of his assets back home were confiscated, and he officially began his life in exile. Fritz would revise this story as he told it and retold it across the decades. Sometimes he didn't have any trouble cutting the carpet with a razor blade, and he stored his cash there. Other times he hid it behind a picture on the bathroom wall. In one version, his girlfriend Lily Latte was along for the ride. In another, he pretended to be drunk, which somehow allayed the suspicion of the Nazi border guards. But the meeting with Goebbels and the flight from Berlin that same night, that was the spine of the narrative that Lang first started spinning about a decade after it supposedly transpired, and would keep spinning for the rest of his life. It was, in his own words, something out of a bad film. It was also mostly bullshit. When historians got a chance to look at Lang's passport from that period, they confirmed that he'd stayed in Germany for months longer than he'd claimed. Rather than leave in March or April, he hung around until the end of July. And Goebbels was fastidious when it came to journaling. Yet his diaries don't mention any long cinematic meeting with the most famous figure in his most beloved industry. The people who knew Lang also cast doubt on his account. The cinematographer Fritz Arno Wagner remembered Lang telling him about Goebbels' offer and asking for advice on whether or not to accept, suggesting that rather than immediately flee the country, he took some time to consider the job. He was also careful to arrange a soft landing for himself in Paris, securing a contract with his one-time producer and longtime friend Erich Palmer, who, being Jewish himself, had already fled to France. This isn't to say that the Nazis never posed a threat to Lang, or that he's not a victim of their anti-Semitic policies. Even if he had decided to take Goebbels up on the job offer, Lang would have still been at risk as the Nazis took their anti-Semitism ever further, culminating, of course, in the Holocaust. and the boycott of Jewish businesses that the Nazis instigated starting in April of 1933, it could have threatened the commercial viability of his films. But given what we know of the timeline, it certainly appears that passing on the opportunity to become Germany's Führer of film, it was a struggle for him, not something he rejected out of hand. Gottfried Reinhardt, a fellow refugee and the son of the theater pioneer Max Reinhardt, he probably had it right when he told an interviewer, "Lang could have stayed in Germany. There's no question about it. He tried to stay. He was a dishonorable man, a totally cynical man. I don't think he gave a damn about politics." Suffice it to say that Lang wasn't exactly popular with his fellow German exiles, either in Paris or, ultimately, in Hollywood. It certainly didn't help that the experience of fleeing a fascist regime had failed to make him any kinder or prompt him to reassess his priorities. Even as a refugee, Fritz Lang still only gave a shit about Fritz Lang. When his assistant, Konrad von Molo, decided that it was time for him to leave Germany too, Lang promised that there would be a job waiting for him in Paris. As von Molo was boarding the train out of Berlin, Lang's housekeeper appeared and asked him to bring the director some mail. Von Molo agreed. When he disembarked in Paris, Fritz Lang himself was waiting on the platform. Lang's first words were, "Where is the money?" It turned out that the mail included a fat wad of cash, at least 100,000 Reichsmarks. This at a time when people leaving Germany were only allowed to have 150 marks on them. Lang had tricked his old assistant into smuggling his money into France, knowing full well that if he'd been caught at the German border, he could have faced jail time or worse. He then proceeded to tell von Molo that there was no job for him after all, that Palmer was only hiring Jews since Gentiles like him could still get hired back home. If he wanted, though, Lang would let him hang around for a few days, quote, as a sort of holiday in Paris. Fuck Fritz Lang. So, Fritz Lang, undeniably a talented filmmaker, but as a person, he's kinda garbage. Fujifilm cameras, though, they are decidedly not garbage. They take sharp, clean, bright photos that you can be proud of. And at least to my knowledge, no Fujifilm camera has ever tricked its assistant into unwittingly smuggling a bunch of cash out of Nazi Germany, which is just one more reason that I'm a fan of Fujifilm. The divorce of Fritz Lang and Thea von Harbou was finalized on April 20th, 1933, Adolf Hitler's 44th birthday. A few years later, she and I.E. Tendolkar would marry in secret. Even though the Nazis and some segments of the Indian community had formed a strange, tentative alliance based on Aryan racial mythology and a mutual antipathy toward Great Britain, their tolerance only went so far. If one of the star screenwriters of the Third Reich was going to cleave herself to a distinctly un-German man, it would have to be behind closed doors. Her defenders will point to the fact that there isn't much indication that Thea von Harbou was publicly or privately anti-Semitic. But given that she was an enthusiastic member of the Nazi Party, we can infer that she at least had a very high tolerance for that kind of bigotry. After all, this is a woman who socialized regularly with Goebbels through the 1930s, and who'd write 26 movies for the Nazi film industry. Now, I can't tell you what von Harbou thought about Jewish people in her heart of hearts, and frankly, it doesn't matter. This might sound flippant, but when I think about Thea von Harbou, I think about a moment from the Netflix animated show BoJack Horseman. Stay with me here. In one episode, late in the show's run, BoJack asks his friend Diane whether she thinks that he's a good person deep down. She responds by saying,
"I don't think I believe in deep down. I kind of think all you are is just the things that you do."
The people who were close to her remember von Harbou as being kind, a bit maternal, and, as Goebbels put it in his diary, a very clever woman. I find it plausible that she didn't froth at the mouth when she thought about Jewish people. She worked amicably alongside Jewish colleagues for years, and she knew Lang's ethnic background when she married him. But when the chips were down, she chose fascism. She chose hate. She chose to put her support, her talent, and her fame behind a movement that she knew to be racist, homophobic, anti-democratic, and violent. The fact that she could be polite to Jews, or even have Jewish friends or Jewish husband, or that she maybe sometimes thought that Hitler's rhetoric was a bit embarrassing or uncouth. How much does that fucking matter? The Nazi regime, Jim Crow, the presidency of Donald Trump. You just don't get that industrial scale cruelty if it only has the support of the out and proud sadists. It needs the Thea von Harbous of the world to prop it up. The choice to lend your support to that kind of darkness, it doesn't tell us the whole story about someone, but it certainly tells us something, and something important. But that impulse to cast judgment, as understandable and maybe righteous as it is, it has to be weighed against the lesson that we learned from Fritz Lang. The lesson that so much of our lives and our legacies is left up to chance. Unlike von Harbou, he was someone who was terrible to the people in his life. He never gave a shit about anyone but himself, and it was that sense of self-interest, and as far as I can tell, only that sense, that kept him from taking Goebbels up on that offer. If he hadn't recognized that the regime may at some point in the future come to see him as Jewish, if he hadn't had Palmer to give him a job in Paris, if he hadn't felt the need to escape the personal embarrassment of his wife's infidelity, it's not hard at all to imagine him with a swastika armband, presiding over the German film industry like a tyrant. But things happened like they happened. For his own reasons, Lang did not join the Nazi Party, nor did he collaborate with them. He fled, and almost in spite of himself, he stayed on the right side of history. Lang was able to come to Hollywood and spin his bullshit version of events, somewhat successfully passing himself off as a daring, anti-fascist hero. Part of why Nazi Germany still fascinates so many people is that it seems to offer such intense ethical decisions and dramatic stakes. It's a tool for us to exercise our moral imaginations and a metaphor through which to understand our own choices. But the stories of these artists, Thea von Harbou and Fritz Lang, they point to the limits of thought exercises about who in our lives today would have gone Nazi. Contingency just plays too strong a role. Fleeing is easy when you've got a job waiting for you in Paris and are willing to con your colleagues into smuggling your savings across the border. When we think about the heroes and villains of history, their moral strength is only part of the equation, sometimes a very small part. Bad people make the right choices for selfish reasons. Kind, thoughtful people make the wrong choices for perfectly understandable reasons. But it is the choices themselves that we remember. What you or I would have done if we'd been born, say, in Berlin in like 1905, it isn't just unknowable. It's an incoherent question. Born to who? In what circumstances? With what opportunities and what obstacles? But what we can do is look back at how these brilliant, but very, very flawed people played the hands that they were dealt. And let that inform the way that we play our own. Next week, we reach the end. We'll check back in with a few of our protagonists, F.W. Murnau and G.W. Pabst, but the bulk of the show will be dedicated to one film, Joseph von Sternberg's The Blue Angel, the movie that made Marlene Dietrich a star. You can stream it for free on YouTube. The link is up on the show's website, hauntedscreenpod.com. Watch if you want, and don't if you don't. Either way, I hope to see you there so that we can finish this story together. The theme song for The Haunted Screen, as well as other music, comes courtesy of the Great Pacific Garbage Vortex. Additional music from Coma Media, Antipodian Writer, Eddie Cantor, Les FM, and Amaranta Music. In accordance with the principles of fair use, we use clips from Hot Tub Time Machine 2, William Friedkin's interview with Fritz Lang, Kritzberger Steinerson, Copacabana, Casablanca, Looney Tunes, Rocky and Bullwinkle, Scooby-Doo, The Flintstones Meet Rockula and Frankenstone, The Simpsons, Tiny Toon Adventures, Ren and Stimpy, Boo Berry Cereal, SpongeBob SquarePants, British Pathé, The Associated Press, KGW8 Portland, and BoJack Horseman. As always, thanks to our sponsor Fujifilm, and to you for giving me your time.